Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 20th of June, where we are talking about Jane Eyre. And at this point, you should have handed in your paper, unless you've arranged for an extension. And I am in the midst of evaluating those papers, and we'll get them back to you, to your email, since I asked you to send them to my email. That's how my grading program works best. And everybody has the option of doing a revision. After you have reviewed my comments, you are free to incorporate them into a new version of the paper. And I ask that if you are doing a revision, that you submit in the original with my commentary along with your revision, and you end up getting the higher of the two grades, because I see the first paper as a learning exercise. And that's basically how professional authors write. At any rate, they basically go through lots of edits and lots of feedback. And certainly if you're content with your grade, you don't need to rewrite the paper, but it's just an option that everybody has. And you have up until the ending of the semester, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And as you know, you can now begin thinking about paper number 2, which is going to be very similar to paper number 1. My suspicion is that paper number 2 should be an easier exercise because you've already gone through the exercise of running paper number 1. Paper 2 is due at the ending of the semester, so there wouldn't be time for a revision. The idea is that you would have learned from the first paper. And Jane Eyre would be an excellent choice for paper number 2, though we have other options coming up. And as you know, we briefly discussed Jane Eyre, and I had talked about how it's definitely one of my favorites of the semester. It's a Gothic romance that gives lots of social and religious commentary. It was written under a pseudonym, Currer Bell. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why the author was able to make such statements without the kind of fallback, or without the kind of pushback that other individuals received. I can't help but think of Kate Chopin and The Awakening, though as progressive and as scandalous as this book is, it's not nearly as much as The Awakening, as we will see. And reviewers, including female reviewers such as Elizabeth Rigby, had said that the author of Jane Eyre should be blamed for the highest moral offense a novel writer can commit, that of making an unworthy character interesting, saying that the book was mischievous and vulgar, pandering to the public taste for illegitimate romance. And more often than not, the film adaptation does focus on the romance, but there is so much more there in terms of Jane Eyre, who basically is a poor orphan, a plain Jane, if you will. And this woman, as a little girl, has a self-respect that's to be admired even in today's age. And this is very much a coming-of-age novel. As some of you had indicated, Persuasion was as well in some respects. But certainly we go through a longer time period as we have Jane as an adult looking back upon her youth. And unlike Anne in Persuasion, since Anne is an observer, Jane is very much an active participant. And Erica Young, a very famous feminist critic, talked about that Jane might be the first heroine in fiction to know she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine, and I definitely agree. In the preface, the author says that conventionality is not morality and self-righteousness is not religion. I think we'll see that Charlotte Bronte lives up to that in the way that she depicts her characters. And I had suggested, because this is such a long novel, to think of it as 4 separate pieces. The Gateshead piece, chapters 1 through 4. The Lowood piece, chapters 5 through 10. The Thornfield piece, chapters 11 through 27. The Morehouse Marsh End piece, chapter 28 through 35. You can even think of Ferndean as another piece. So that would be basically 5. And Ferndean would be 26 through 38. So that would be 5 sections if you want to think about it that way. And I had suggested you want to pay close attention to the names because they are relevant. So think about Gateshead. And a gate can serve to entrap someone, but also you can open the gate so that you can achieve freedom. And both will happen to Jane. And we learn that right at the very beginning, Jane is lamenting the fact that there's no possibility of a walk that day, just to sort of illustrate symbolically her entrapment. Going on a walk is very important. We saw this in Persuasion, actually, but we will see this again in Jane Eyre. And Jane is sitting cross-legged, reading on a dreary November day. Now, certainly a dreary November day gives us the Gothic elements, which we talked about with Frankenstein, the Gothic atmosphere. But sitting cross-legged is definitely something that's considered unladylike. And even reading, as we know from the Cult of True Womanhood, could be seen as rather risque. And what we see is a very strong and stubborn Jane as a child. She resisted punishment, which she says was a new thing for her. She's only 10 years old when she's taken to the Red Room. And part of it is because she's punished unjustly. And one of the things that we will see throughout the novel is that Jane very much fights against injustice. And the Red Room also gives us the Gothic element about the possibility of hauntings and spirits. And one of the things that I talk about in Gothic Lit and also in my horror film class is that you can read hauntings and spirits from a literal perspective, but also from a symbolic perspective as well. And that you will see that our main character, whose name is Rochester, he is haunted by his past, so to speak. But at any rate, in chapter 3, we get an adult Jane sort of reflecting back on that episode, saying that she ought to forgive Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed is her aunt, and notice the last name Reed, something that is basically thin and stiff and brittle. That very much, I think, describes the character. Mrs. Reed has taken in the orphan Jane to raise her. And Mrs. Reed doesn't treat Jane very well because Jane is not one of her birth children. In some ways, this is almost like a fairy tale Cinderella story with the fairy godmother and the wicked stepmother. And Mrs. Reed basically being the wicked stepmother, if you will. And Miss Temple, someone we'll talk about shortly, could be the fairy godmother, if you will. But basically, Mrs. Reed is not necessarily giving Jane the love and the attention that all children deserve, but Jane in particular, because Jane isn't nearly as self-centered or spoiled as Mrs. Reed's own children. But that said, Jane is also a product of her environment. And while Jane as an adult is reflecting back that she should forgive Mrs. Reed for the injustices that were imposed upon Jane in her childhood, that Jane talks about in her childhood that I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste. So again, this idea of being born in a privileged society, even if Jane is considered poverty-stricken, there is a certain level of comfort in living with the Reed family. The backstory is that Jane's birth mother had married a poor clergyman and was disinherited. And we know the consequences of that after reading Persuasion, the importance of making a good match. And after Jane's parents died, Mr. Reed, basically the mother's brother, took in Jane, and then Mr. Reed died, and Mrs. Reed, his wife, grudgingly raised Jane, while Mrs. Reed is spoiling her other children. They're 3, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. And later on in the novel, we'll find out what happens to them as adults. In chapter 4 is when we're introduced to another character, Mr. Brocklehurst, who's supposed to represent the hypocrisy of organized religion, specifically Christianity. He's described as this black pillar, a rigid, hypocritical religion, basically, is what he symbolizes. And he runs the Lowood boarding school. Lowood, something that's low or something that is inferior. Again, the importance of names. And Jane tells Mr. Brocklehurst at one point that the way she'll avoid hell is by not dying. That obviously was not the answer he was looking for. You've got to admire the spunk of this character. And Jane, even though she's just a child, tells Mrs. Reed that Mrs. Reed is bad, hard-hearted, and deceitful. And again, think about the power dynamics and the power inequality between the two. So as we move forward and Jane transitions from Gateshead to Lowood, low suggestive of low or poor, in some ways Jane's situation ironically improves. This is a boarding school, so this novel is very much a commentary as well about some of the poor conditions of boarding schools at the time. And the many deprivations that they oftentimes experienced in the name of Christianity. This is where Jane meets a teacher who takes her under her wing, so to speak, Miss Temple. Think about a temple as a sanctuary, a place of safety. This is also where Jane makes a friend, Helen Burns. We could say that Helen burns an impression upon Jane. Burning, also the idea of fire, it can represent extremes. Helen Burns is very Christian, and we can see that this novel, much like Persuasion, very much focuses on the idea of moderation and avoiding the extremes. One of the things that Jane says in chapter 8 is that if others didn't love her, she'd rather die than live alone. And this is something that we will see Jane revisit as an adult and realize that her self-worth is really much more important. Eventually, Helen dies of tuberculosis, which was a major epidemic during the time. And that said, it could be that Helen dies because she was too focused on the afterlife to really be able to live, as opposed to Jane, who really embraces the idea of living. And the passion that Jane has is one that she can't extinguish, and it's not a bad thing that she has passion, or at least it's presented in this particular novel in that way. Or as Jane says, the world is pleasant, it would be dreary to be called from it. One of the things that Jane is able to embrace is Mother Nature, and we know how nature is associated with the feminine. We had talked about this with Frankenstein, for instance. As a result of all of the deaths that occur because of tuberculosis at the boarding school, improvements are made to Lowood, and Jane finds what she calls a new servitude by boldly advertising for employment as a governess. And again, think about the kind of strength that Jane has. At this point, Miss Temple is left because she's married, so she can't, once she marries, maintain her profession. At least that would have been the expectation during that time period. And Jane realizes that without Miss Temple, there really is nothing holding her there. So she wants to expand her horizons. In other words, she wants to live life. Again, something that would be discouraged for female during this time period. And she does find employment at Thornfields. And think about that name. A field is something that's positive and green and open, but thorns can prick and hurt and inflict pain. So there are going to be positives and negatives for Jane at Thornfield. She meets the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, and even Mrs. Fairfax talks about the status and class distinctions of society, saying that the other employees at the home are merely servants, so she can't converse with them on terms of equality. And the child that Jane is supposed to work with, being the governess for, is Adele Varennes. That's Jane's pupil. It's supposed to be Rochester's ward, and Rochester, we find out, is the master of Thornfield's estate. She may be, perhaps, Rochester's illegitimate child, and we'll learn more about that. But whether she is Rochester's illegitimate child or not, Adele has been abandoned by her mother, and Rochester feels this sense of responsibility. In other words, Rochester shows honor, not always, but sometimes. And this is where we hear this strange ghost-like laugh, again, that gives the idea of a mystery that needs to be solved, very gothic. And that said, Jane makes reflections in chapter 12 about how human beings must have action, and that women in particular are supposed to remain calm, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation, and it's narrow-minded to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings, knitting stockings, playing on the piano, and embroidering bags. In some way she reminds me of and Elliot in Persuasion. And then Jane basically leaves the house, and think about how the house during this time period was presented as a kind of prison. She goes outdoors to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax, and this is where Jane is able to expand her horizons and her social circle, so to speak. She meets and helps a stranger who she later finds out is Mr. Rochester, the master of the house. He's 20 years Jane's senior. He's fallen off his horse, and Jane is pleased to have done something, an active thing, describing Rochester as masculine, dark, strong, and stern. He very much falls into the idea of the Byronic hero, if you know anything about Byron, a great romantic poet. This is a strong, dark, mysterious man with terrible secrets, and while exhibiting a sense of honor, also exhibits a sense of error and corruption that needs to be rectified by some sort of outside force. Jane, from the very beginning, shows a certain strength and independence to Rochester, which he personally finds very appealing, considering the role that women are supposed to play and do play in his time period, as we saw in reading The Cult of the True Womanhood. And we learn a little bit of backstory about Rochester. He's inherited Thornfields after his brother died. Again, we talked about the importance of inheritance and bloodlines and persuasion. We'll see that played out in Jane Eyre, where as the novel progresses, we get more and more into the romance where Rochester is expecting Jane to act like every other woman. So when he asks her if he's handsome, she's supposed to say yes. After all, she's his servant. She's his employee. She says no. And then Rochester asks Jane to speak. She remains silent. Eventually stating that nothing freeborn would submit to insolence, even for a salary. Again, showing Jane's great strength of character and independence. In chapter 15, Rochester's bed is set on fire, possibly by the servant Grace Poole. So we're wondering at this point if Grace Poole is responsible for that ghostly laugh. Jane assists Rochester. A little bit of foreshadowing here, because basically we're going to learn about Rochester's history, and it does have something to do with this bed, the marriage bed, to be direct. So I hope I'm not giving away any spoilers by this point in the semester. In chapter 16, Rochester brings Miss Blanche to Thornfield. She's beautiful, she's vain, she's arrogant, and he's basically using her as a pawn to make Jane jealous. Not that Jane is aware of that at that point. Again, we can't really support Rochester's actions as readers. It's one of the reasons why he needs to be humbled and put into his place as the novel progresses. He demands that Jane keep them company when they are socializing with their friends and so forth. By this point, Jane has fallen in love with him, so it's torturous to see Rochester with another woman. But she says she does not condemn him for marrying only for interests and connections, as Jane is quite certain that the reason why Rochester is interested in Miss Blanche is because of her status and perhaps her money. This is where we're introduced to another character in chapter 18, Mr. Mason. He mysteriously appears from Jamaica. So, there's a long tradition of the Gothic that which is exotic is considered other or alien, comes with a certain level of danger. This is where, and oftentimes this is something that's cut. A lot of things are usually cut in adaptations of Jane Eyre because of the sheer length. Rochester decides on having a little bit of fun at Jane's and other people's expenses by dressing up basically as a gypsy and telling fortunes. And of course, because Rochester knows all of the individuals at Thornfield, his fortunes are quite accurate. And what he tells Jane is that you're cold because you're alone. No contact strikes from the fire from that is in you. You're sick because the best of feelings, the highest and the sweetest to man, keeps far away from you. You're silly because suffer as you may not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it waits you. And Jane's brow professes to say, this is what the gypsy woman, who is of course Rochester, says, I can live alone if self-respect and the circumstance requires me to do so. I have an inward treasure born within me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld, or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give. And again, think about how incredibly modern and mature that sentiment is. Of course, Jane finds out about the fiction of Rochester as the gypsy woman, and then at that point it turns out that there is a whore with Mr. Mason and he's stabbed, and Jane helps Rochester nurse Mr. Mason. Very much like in The Cult of True Womanhood, Jane very much is the caretaker and nurse. One of the things that Jane says about Rochester: if anyone you know has suffered and erred, let him look higher than his equals for strength to amend and solace to heal. In other words, we shouldn't judge. There's a higher power that can judge. This is where we are going to actually return back to Gateshead, where Jane receives word that John Reed, remember her cousin, has died. The assumption is that it's through a suicide, in part because of debts and gambling and so forth. And when Jane returns to Gateshead, because she's been called, summoned, in effect, by Mrs. Reed, Jane finds Georgiana, who's become this spoiled, arrogant woman. Think Mary Elliott, if you will, from Persuasion, or I should say Mary Musgrove from Persuasion. She's basically looking for a rich suitor to marry. Again, very Persuasion-like. Eliza has gone to the other extreme. And again, extremes are bad in this novel, and usually are in most pieces of literature. Eliza's become a cold, distant, religious woman who plans to join a nunnery. She's not necessarily as bad as Georgiana, but again, I can't help but think of Helen Burns, that she's not able to appreciate the joys and passions of life itself. And then Mrs. Reed, who's now an old dying woman, first refuses to accept Jane's apology, which goes to show that Jane is really the bigger of the two. And then Mrs. Reed reveals a letter that she's been hiding. And it reminds me very much of Frankenstein, how oftentimes information was revealed through letters. And the letter indicates that Jane does indeed have family. She wasn't an orphan. She had a distant uncle who was looking to adopt her, but Mrs. Reed kept that information secret. Chapter 23 is when Rochester proposes to Jane. This is one of the highlights of the novel. He's smoking a cigar. If you know anything about Sigmund Freud, considered the father of psychology, he oftentimes talked about how seemingly innocent things could serve as phallic symbols depending on their shape, specifically things like cigars. So this episode is oftentimes read from a very Freudian perspective, that the undercurrent here is sexuality, which of course was something that was not condoned prior to marriage. So marriage was particularly attractive to individuals just so they could consummate relationships from a socially acceptable way, at least. And he admits at this point that he was trying to make Jane jealous, and lightning strikes at this point and splits the chestnut tree. There's a good amount of foreshadowing and omens in here in this novel. In chapter 24, we see how Rochester wants to basically turn Jane into one of the rich and spoiled women of his class. He wants to give her silks and pearls. Jane refuses. Again, rather bold. And in order to keep Rochester at bay, states, I won't be your English Celine Varens, which is the woman that he was having an affair with, that perhaps he fathered a child with. And Jane says, I shall continue to act as Adele's governess, and by that I shall earn my board and lodging. Again, think about how incredibly brave and strong that is at this time period. And the assumption is that once a woman married, that she would no longer maintain any kind of profession or employment. And you shall give me nothing. And she said that while this frustrated him, it also kept him in, quote, reasonable check, unquote. So there also is, I think, a very tongue-in-cheek sort of commentary about gender and relationships in here, and that you don't want to be too submissive in a relationship, because then the other partner becomes bored or becomes disinterested. Jane had a disturbing dream. Again, lots of dreams, lots of omens that serve as foreshadowings. Again, that's very Gothic, of of terrible events occurring, and that her wedding veil is ripped in two. There's going to be some foreshadowing about how things are going to go poorly for her marriage. And we get the big reveal, the big secret, again with the laugh that we've been wondering, is that Grace Poole, is that Mr. Rochester is still married. And in fact, he was married and is still married to Mr. Mason's mad sister, and this is why Mr. Mason was there, Bertha. And Grace Poole was basically a servant who was taking care of Bertha in Thornfield. There's been a lot of commentary about putting the mad woman in the attic in literature, and we see that with Bertha. In fact, if you're interested in Bertha's story, of course fictional, you might be interested in an author who decided to take up that story, Jean Rice, entitled Wide Sargasso Sea. And we learned that basically Rochester needed to marry Bertha in order to maintain a certain level of economic independence, because he wasn't the firstborn son. Again, sort of reinforcing the idea that we've seen in Persuasion as well, about the importance of maintaining inheritance. And he found out only after the fact that the match that was made for him was a woman who was unsuitable, as far as he said, because of her insanity. And so Rochester thinks that he has a sense of responsibility to this woman, so that he's going to basically care for her, or have his servants care for her. But he's going to live his own life. And again, you can think about his actions as being very unjust, as he locks Bertha away, but from his perspective, and perhaps from society's or some people's perspective in this society, that his actions were one of empathy and caretaking. And at this point, Rochester wants to, if whether or not Jane decides to formally marry him, continue his relationship with Jane. And Jane says that she can't do it because he's married to somebody else. Jane has ethics and morals that we see throughout the entire novel. And one of the things that Jane says to herself in chapter 27 is that none shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand. A little bit of foreshadowing what's going to happen to Rochester. And she says that she won't become Rochester's mistress, even though she's tempted. After all, she's human. And she says, do as I do, trust in God and yourself, believe in heaven, hope to meet again there. And it's not that this novel is anti-religious. It's quite spiritual and quite religious. It's against the hypocrisy of organized religion. And she thinks to herself, I can care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. It is one of my favorite quotes in the book. This is where Jane in chapter 28 flees the comfort and safety and love that she's found in Thornfield, and she goes into nature. If you are familiar with King Lear, there are lots of winks and nods associated with King Lear, who also basically tries to survive in nature. And Jane talks about how nature is the universal mother who's benign and good. It's something we talked about with Frankenstein. And we see her experiencing the physical and emotional pain of becoming a beggar. Perhaps that's the only way that she can truly empathize with the poor, is by being poor herself and realizing the horrors associated with it. Of course, Jane isn't in that situation for long, but enough to basically change her perceptions of the world. She's rescued by a family called the Rivers family. It's made up of Mary, Diana, and St. John at Marsh End, or also known as Morehouse. Marsh End, this is going to be the ending of the marsh, or the ending of negative things for Jane. Morehouse, this is a house where she's going to find more. It's the ending of pain and the beginning of happiness. So Jane basically is in a fever for 3 days, and she awakes after the third day. If you're familiar with Christianity, 3 is a very powerful symbol, oftentimes associated with Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. What we see here is that Jane has a kind of physical and also spiritual rebirth. So again, in Christianity, it takes Jesus 3 days to rise from the dead. And this is where Jane is able to tell through personal experience, the housekeeper, that poverty is not a crime, which is something that I think Sir Walter would have thought and does think in places like Persuasion and novels like Persuasion. Jane bonds quite well with Mary and Diana, feels a very sisterly-like connection with them. Not so much with St. John, who offers her a humble job of teaching poor children, which Jane accepts. And of course, that's a much step lower than being a governess of a family of status and wealth, because Jane needs to learn some elements of humility as well. And this is where we find out, a happy coincidence, that the Rivers family had a long-lost uncle whose name was John, who died and not left them an inheritance. And while this is occurring, Jane is admitting that she felt degraded by the ignorance, the poverty, and the coarseness of her students, but she knew those feelings were wrong and she was striving to overcome them. Meanwhile, St. John is trying to struggle against his attraction, because he's a clergy person, to a rich and vivacious Miss Oliver. What he wants to do is be a missionary. He's cold, he's hard, ambitious, almost like Eliza, in the sense that he doesn't have passion and he doesn't have life. So he thinks that basically Jane would be the perfect wife for him. What we learn is that Jane, who's been using a pseudonym, by the way, since she's left Thornfield, she took the last name of Elliot. No connection to Persuasion, it's just a coincidence. That Jane Elliot is really Jane Eyre, who is in all of the newspapers of the time being frantically searched for by Mr. Rochester. And we get another big reveal, that St. John, Mary, and Diana, the Rivers family, in effect, they're all cousins of Jane's. Maybe we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here. And that the Uncle John that I was referencing, the rich bachelor uncle, left his inheritance to Jane. And if you think about her name, I talked about the significance of the first name, but not the last. Her surname is Eyre, E-Y-R-E, or you could spell that H-E-I-R, because she is the heir to a fortune and also a family. And for her, the family is going to be just as important, if not more so, than the fortune. And he basically gave all of his fortune to Jane in revenge against the Rivers' mother, his sister, who basically married a poor clergyman, Jane's parents, in effect. So, and that said, Jane joyfully, fairly shares her fortune with everyone, because again, she does believe in justice. And as St. John proposes to Jane to be a missionary's wife, not for love, not for passion, but in order to serve God and to go to India. And Jane refuses. And this is where, if there are any supernatural elements in the book, it's here in chapter 35, where Jane hears Rochester's voice calling her from afar. And as we find out later, that Rochester hears the same voice. So this is where Jane returns to Thornfield. This could be the ending of the novel, where it turns out Thornfield is a burnt out ruin. It's been destroyed in a fire. Rochester's wife has been killed in the fire. Rochester tried to save her. So we see how he's honorable there and doing the right thing. But now, luckily, I guess, for Jane and Rochester, Rochester is now a widow. Rochester has been maimed by that fire. And he's blind. We could say that throughout the entire novel, Rochester was blind, and now he can see the great irony of not having physical sight, but having insight. So if you know literary texts such as Oedipus the King, this by Sophocles, from Greek tragedy, 430 BC, there's a great literary tradition of vision and blindness being used thematically. And basically, because Thornfield is uninhabitable, Rochester is now in Ferndean. You can think about ferns, things that are luscious and green and growing. Again, very positive. And Jane, who not only is independent, she's always been independent, but she has wealth and she has family, is able to reunite with the Rochesters, who's become quite humble, because now he really depends on Jane because of his blindness and because of the fact that he's been maimed. So in some ways, she takes the power in the relationship. So that when we get to chapter 37, we get that happy ending that we've been wanting in a romance, that they've been married for 10 years, Rochester and Jane. They have a family. They're reunited with Adele. There is even some return of Rochester's physical sight. But of course, he's had insight. And think about all of the themes that you can find in Jane Eyre, from gender to class to religion to hypocrisy to honor, to name just a few. So for today's attendance question, so that'll be due Saturday on the 22nd on our class discussion forum. Again, if you need more time, just let me know. I've identified some quotes. I'd like you to identify a quote that you find particularly compelling in Jane Eyre, and there are so many, and briefly indicate why, so that next class we can put some closure onto Jane Eyre, and then we can continue on. And as you know, I had offered you the BBC version of Jane Eyre if you wanted to see the miniseries. That said, it's not exactly like the book, but it's fairly close compared to other adaptations, which means that it has a good amount of length to it, because usually adaptations will delete sections. So if you did choose to watch that, whether you chose to watch it last weekend or this upcoming weekend, understand that's a supplement to, not a substitute for reading the book itself. So the good news is that the bulk of the reading is basically done by this point in the semester. But we'll talk a little bit more about that next class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.